Good morning again to another entry of Snow Cone Diaries. It is October 2nd, 2021. It's a Saturday morning. A cup of coffee, practice a little meditation for a couple of minutes, trying to clear the head, so to speak. And that's actually a very good intro into what I want to cover a little bit today. I've talked a little bit about sort of the philosophical aspects of some of the ideas that I've explored. Objective realism, what that is, how that sort of originates and comes out of Enlightenment era philosophy, and sort of this belief in, this casting away of God, as Nietzsche says, God is dead, and this sort of adoption of, physicalism, scientism, objective realism, that, the physical world is the only world that we can really speak intelligently about. Anything beyond that is not only conjecture, it's unreal. And so you kind of have that kind of intellectual landscape, so to speak, which is the landscape that we're all taught in the world that we live in, and that capitalism and sort of Western society is based on. Okay, all of these other activities and domains are to be speculated by people that are not scientists. And why would you believe anybody who's not a scientist? I mean, now in these days, people barely believe scientists. Everybody's got an axe to grind. But part of what we're trying to bring about is this expansion of scientific knowledge, of the domain of science, what it means to really know and understand what is the data telling us about the world that we live in, and about reality, metaphysics, ultimately. It seems like this sort of far-off philosophical idea, but really it has immense and profound, very practical considerations, as it's concerned with the structure of society, and with what it means to do good, and what the implications are to you and the people close to you and to your family. Very, very practical considerations here, and ultimately everything comes around to that. Despite the fact that we'll talk a lot about the physical world not necessarily, reality not necessarily being everything that we think it is. And so I want to start, we've talked a little bit about, looking at, as Tesla would have us, frequency, vibration, and energy, looking at the world from that perspective. And as the physical world and matter being an extension of that idea, as quantum theory tells us, quantum physics tells us, rather than us being physical forms existing in a material world and perishing at death, right? So, and part of that premise again is based upon the idea that the consciousness and the soul exists and persists beyond death. Okay, this is really undisputable at this point, and it's a really, really important sort of critical intellectual leap that you have to take. And as I've said in virtually all of these diary entries, if you cannot make that leap for whatever reason, and you were stuck in the material world, and you think the soul is, something that Rumi writes about in his poetry, and Khalil Gibran and other poets, because they're out of their minds, then you need to go do some research. You need to do some research around near-death experiences, and around altered state of consciousness, and I would just start there. And you need to open your mind to the idea that what it is that seems to be you has different layers to it, right? And I do have some notes here, and from a layering perspective, from a metaphysics perspective, there's the chakra system, okay, which is the 7, and there's the planets, okay, and there's also sort of an external symbiotic relationship you have with your family, with your friends, with your workplace, and this is sort of the idea of the 7 spheres. And I wrote a blog entry about that a couple of weeks ago, which you should you should check out. And once you sort of transform into the idea of, you as sort of an energy being, right? You have sort of an optimization that you try and do in terms of tuning yourself, not only with your inside, who you are intrinsically, what you manifest, and then also the outside world. And there's a very direct relationship, tangential and contingent relationship between the physical, the outside world, and the inside world, as Descartes lays out, res cogitans, res extensa, and as we know from quantum mechanics, okay, that the world is very non-local in a real and measurable way, right? And those are facts that help us understand and give us sort of point us in the direction of what the true nature of this world is. So, you have sort of physics, classical physics, Newtonian physics, quantum physics, and, relativity, which sort of describe, we'll call the physical domain, right? And then you have, following Descartes' model, res extensa, let's say, and then you have res cogitans, which is the world of thought, okay? The two are, again, related. We know that if you visualize things, you can affect the outcomes. I was watching yesterday about a video about some guys that are practicing free throws, and they had 3 groups. First group actually practiced free throws for 3 weeks. The second group actually just thought about practicing free throws for 3 weeks, and the third group didn't think about or practice free throws. So the third group did the worst, and the first 2 groups actually did about the same in terms of improvement, which tells you that the visualization, and any athlete knows this. I was an aspiring professional tennis player for many years. I still play. The ability to visualize what it is that you're doing and to see it in your mind's eye is not just a technique, right? It speaks to the nature of the relationship between mind and matter. Okay, which is very subtle, and yet there is a relationship there. And when we get into Kant and metaphysics and more of the philosophical stuff, you could see that he is part of the revolutionary aspect of his work, is he not only recognized that, but he actually restructures metaphysics around that principle, that we can't necessarily know the world as it is, but we can know and speak of the world as it appears to us. And based upon that, we can make various, deductive conclusions about the nature of time and space and causality as it is reflected and, depended upon in our kind of cognitive capabilities. And we expand upon that and flesh that out in quite a bit of detail as it relates to trying to root it into modern physics understandings. Okay, and so we sort of tailor and customize Kant's metaphysics to try and bring it up to date, more or less. And that's really the postmodern metaphysics is the name of that book that I wrote last year that's still in publishing, that talks a little bit about that, which sort of moves the dial in a way. But what I want to get into a little bit is I want to get into what we know, okay? What everybody knows, not what some guru that's sitting on top of the mountain knows, not what some, talented psychologist or somebody that, can hypnotize people and go into regressive past lives, and, there's all sorts of shit that goes on. But let's talk about what we know and what we can explore. Where do we start? Okay, we take sort of the classical skeptical attitude of the scientist. Well, what do we know? We know that we can perceive the world. We know that we are a thinking thing. We know that, we can process information. We can reflect. We can project. And we can not only just influence the world around us, but we can also deduce and sort of make predictions about what might come. This is this idea of causality. If I do this, and this happens. And this is all sort of baked into the mind at a very real level. So, some of the things, I'm not going to get into too much of the metaphysics aspect of it now. I'm going to stick with the the mental aspect, and there's plenty here. So you have kind of a waking state, and they talk about this in some of the Vedic literature. But you have sort of this idea of the waking state, which is the conscious mind, okay? And then you have, and we all have this, we have a dream state, we have sort of an unconscious mind. And these sort of dual aspects, okay, of the mind give us a little bit of perspective on who we might be, who the real us is. Not saying that this is who you're talking to right now and who's listening to this is unreal necessarily, but this person is not necessarily the same person that's in the dream. Everybody knows that. There's but the weird things can happen in dreams. Time sort of spreads out. Doesn't have the same idea. Scenes can kind of blur into each other. Monsters appear, angels appear. They're weird things in dreams. And we've kind of reached a point now where intellectually we've taken that domain, we've carved it up, we've said it lives in the psychological domain, and we recognize the existence of the unconscious, but we don't recognize its reality, right? Jung talks about the collective unconscious, which is this sort of idea of, archetypical themes that permeate through a particular civilization and a society, and some of the symbols are so old and so core to who we are, they kind of, they go across civilizations and societies. This is The Hero with 1,000 Faces, right? This is Joseph Campbell. And so the unconscious itself not only has an individual kind of component to it, but it has a collective component to it. Well, that's odd. So what are we tapping into there? We're tapping into something, right? There's a ton of data around this, and particularly if you want to understand more of it, you need to really read Jung. And also he has one of his students who wrote a book on mother mythology as well, the maternal figure. You should read him as well. His name escapes me, but if you want to know who it is, just message me and I'll tell you. But so you have this kind of, you have a collective component and you have an individual component too, to the unconscious mind. Some people call it the subconscious, but we're going to use Jung's and Freud's terms here. Freud, as more of a sort of mechanical, behavioral-driven psychologist, talks about, myth as well, but reflecting kind of the base kind of sexual and primal urges that drive us. And then we have a component of our being that sort of controls and boxes that stuff in such that we can be, function in society. Jung's analysis is a little bit deeper than that, in the sense that, we reflect and we understand each other and ourselves ultimately through the kind of archetypical awareness and our connection with, ultimately a greater self, whatever that means. And that's part of what it is that I'm trying to kind of tease out, right? Is you have sort of a waking state consciousness, an entity, a being, that who you are, right? And this is some of the things that you explore in meditation. Who are you? You are not your thoughts. Well, what does that mean? You're a thinking thing, right? But you're not ultimately your thoughts. But let's table the conscious mind for a second and recognize that you have an unconscious mind. And in an unconscious mind, you also have a part of you that persists, that sees the world in a very, very different way. Well, it's a function of your mind. It's fantastic. It's not okay, but it's still, what it does is it helps you understand who you are a little bit better, because there's not just one example, there's two. This is why triangulation is a very important idea that I use a lot with respect to looking at ancient texts and understanding what it is that they're trying to tell us. But also we look at different states of consciousness, and from that we can triangulate into a being that ends up being you, or as close to you as possible from a descriptive matter. And that gives us an opportunity to see things in a different light. It's a level of abstraction. And from that, we can build basically a system of metaphysics that is consistent and coherent, from which we can construct a system of ethics and behavior and form basically, social structures that are consistent with that. So, this is part of why philosophy, over the millennium has been, one of the core intellectual tools that we have as human beings, is because, we could potentially rationally deduce how we should behave and what kind of world we can construct if we understand its basic components and how it works. If you don't understand how it works, to say the same idea in the other way, if you don't understand how it works, you're going to make some mistakes in terms of how you implement and try and craft and create the world. It's one of the reasons why capitalism is effective, because it presumes that people are self-serving beings. It works because it's true. People are generally out for themselves. But the problem is the system itself kind of reinforces this idea. And when you combine it with sort of physicalism, objective realism, when you combine it with materialism, you get some really dysfunctional outcomes. And this is part of what society is kind of rebelling against now, to a certain extent, and what people are trying to change. It's not just equality, but we have the technological capability to build a better society. What are we resisting it for? Because we want to, fund more wars. This is, where people are, running into issues, understandably so. I don't want to get too much into the politics, but that's generally the idea. So to construct something, and this is something that, Plato, my son is reading Plato's Republic right now. And this is the classic example, right? To construct society, you need to understand how the world works and what human beings are within the context of the world. And once you have an idea as to kind of how the structure works, not only just in a static time and place, but how it evolves over time, you're now in a much better position to create lasting structures that incorporate and integrate the basic underlying mechanics and don't reject them, right? And this is part of my background as a systems engineer, and why that perspective, I think, is somewhat unique, right? So yes, I've been practicing yoga for 30 years. Yes, I've practiced meditation and I've been initiated, and I have my fair dose of the otherworldly, let's say. But primarily what I'm looking at is how best to construct the world that we want to live in based upon how the world actually works, not how we would like the world to work, and not denying a fundamental part of our existence, which is effectively what we've done. And the piece that I'm looking to try and overturn, it's that fundamental transition between you looking at yourself as physical form versus a body of energy that is manifest in a physical form and that experiences the world in a physical way through the senses. And this idea of mind, as you sort of unwrap the onion, so to speak, you start to understand that you have the conscious and the unconscious mind fully recognized by the psychological domain, and that your unconscious in turn has a direct relationship in terms of that, not just your conscious mind, but the world that you create around you. This is the whole discipline of psychology is based upon this principle, right? But what you have to understand in terms of identifying who you are is that you have these two aspects of yourself. It's the sun and the moon, right? This is a very old concept, the sun being the conscious mind and the moon being the unconscious mind. And you have sort of the sun god who's over the chariot during the day, who's carrying the sun disk. This is the Egyptian myth, right? He's carrying the sun disk throughout the sky. And then during the nighttime, he goes under the world and battles the serpent to try and bring back the sun disk for everybody the next day so that the sun will rise. And this is the the psychological churning that happens with each and every being on the planet, right? Not just humans. This cycle of the sun and the moon and the seasons, right? This is why it's so baked and integral to the Chinese philosophy, heaven, man, and earth, the I Ching. I have a bunch of articles that I've written about this. But this idea, once we separate ourselves from nature, once we dislocate ourselves from this idea, once these myths become old tales that ignorant people told them, we are losing a dimension of ourselves, which is not only primal in a very real sense, but also from a certain perspective is much more real than the physical world. This is what we get into with altered states, and some other spiritual experiences that you can potentially have, like NDEs, for example. The world seems a lot more real, and this somehow becomes a dream. So that's an illusion. It's a fabrication of your mind. He's on drugs, he's crazy. Okay, but there's this massive body of literature that indicates quite clearly that these states of being are a thing, and they seem to be endemic to humans throughout time and space, immemorial. And in many respects, religious and some of the ancient texts document some of these findings, explain them to us in language, very old language and mythical language, and language that the best language they had to use to describe some of these things. But these are very, very old ideas that we have rejected coming out of the Enlightenment as part of this sort of modern and postmodern era. So, so from a conscious mind perspective, you have this thing called the ego, which is Freud's idea, right? Physical reality, matter, physics, that's that domain. That's a real domain. It has certain laws and behaviors, and it's material. It denies the spirit, effectively. And from a domain perspective, that's fine, as long as you understand what it is you're operating with there. There's self-serving, there's desire, there's all of that stuff which manifests in the conscious mind as us as human beings. And then you have the unconscious mind, where you're introduced to the idea that there's something beyond the conscious mind. You can call it what you will. You can call it the manifestation of the soul. People call it the unconscious, right? But there's an individual entity, a part of you, that experiences the unconscious. So what is that? And this is the part that takes you, it's the first step in your meditation practice that you start to contemplate, that opens doors of understanding. What is this thing that persists? What is this thing that's thinking, that's dreaming? And you have this idea of the witness, which was something that my teacher talked a lot about. But buddhi, the intellect, you have these sort of different aspects of the mind, higher order aspects of the mind, lower M mind, and then higher mind. And this idea of Atman and the soul that is buried basically in the theological landscape of Eurasian antiquity. Not just the spirit world, but the idea that you have a persisting entity that exists beyond death. This is fundamental to the development of Homo sapiens. You have when people start burying people with objects, what are they doing? They're doing that with the understanding, the belief that there is some sort of life after death. You look at the Egyptian Book of the Dead. You look at Hades as it was related in ancient Greece, this sort of myth of the awakening, this sort of myth of rebirth, which is buried in the ancient theological landscape. It is predicated on this idea that you're not this physical form. That's the first fundamental and most important step that you have to take to recognize the nature of the world that you live in. So you have this dream world, and the dichotomy that arises from the sun and the moon relationship, right? The conscious and the unconscious mind, is you have this sort of materialistic world and you have this idealistic world. And those two ideas, when we start getting into the philosophical aspects of intellectual development over time, you start to see that there is this sort of classic dichotomy between the materialists and the idealists. And that's a constant theme in Western thought, really, for 3,000 years. And you see it today, too. In fact, the political divide is along somewhat similar lines. And Plato is the first, true idealist philosopher, right? And at least in the Western tradition, Lao Tzu is actually similar in the Far East, about, again, within 100 years. Like, what's going on? Leave that aside for a second. But then you have Aristotle that comes in, that studies with Plato, that basically says, it's not quite just the ideas, and that the material world comes from the ideas, and that all memory is recollection. It's not quite that. What we have is sort of the form of something, and then we have sort of a substantial form. I mean, in a sense, you could see Aristotle as a Cartesian. And sort of he develops this idea of substantial form, and then he develops an epistemological framework, which is a framework of what is knowledge, what can be known, which is something that I talk about quite a bit in my writing, which is based on causality. Okay, well, it seems like that rests right at, determinism, causality, that's right within the Western tradition, yes, but Aristotle claims that if you need to truly know something, you have to also not only understand what its purpose is, you need to understand why it's been brought into being. What's a table for? How can you understand what a table is if you don't understand that it's meant to put things on, to write or to read or whatever it is, or that a chair is meant for sitting? How can you understand a thing without knowing that? How can you understand life without understanding what the purpose of all this is? You're just going to carve it up, put it to the side, and then live your entire life? What if at the end you realize that why you thought you were here was not the real reason that you were here, and that things weren't the way? Then your entire life was a mistake. This is why these ideas are so important. Because if you peel back the onion a little bit, try